All right. So, welcome, Mr. Scott Ritter, former U.S. Marine and UN Weapons Inspector of the United Nations in Iraq. Uh, he's joining us today for World Pravda, a Telegram channel administered by yours truly, Mr. Serban, which is me. Unfortunately, due to personal issues, I am unable to disclose my identity or my face, but I hope this is enough, and I have prepared some questions for you. So welcome onto the show, Mr. Scott Ritter.
Well, thanks for having me.
Okay, so I have the first question for you. If you could just give us a rundown of the current situation on the battlefields of Ukraine, like what is your opinion on the development of the special military operation in Ukraine currently? We get reports that the Russian army is currently pretty much on the outskirts of Chasov Yar. And we have also reports of potentially a new mobilization wave of about 500,000 men. You have anything you can disclose? Any opinions?
Well, I think to understand what's going on the battlefield today, you have to put it in the perspective of the the overall trajectory of events that collectively we call the special military operation. And I think we need to start with that definition. This did not start out as a war. This was a special military operation where Russia was using military technical means. That's, I guess, you know, diplomatic speak for using military power to generate a political result. War is an extension of politics by other means. And the political result that Russia was looking for early on was not the conquest of Ukraine, the defeat of Ukraine, the acquisition of territory. It was to create a geopolitical reality that was conducive to Russia's national security interests. Russia felt that Ukraine, being a former Soviet republic with deep cultural, historical, linguistic, economic, and indeed political ties with Russia, um, that it would be detrimental to Russian security interests if Ukraine became part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, especially given that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization um, justified its continued existence in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Its continued existence was predicated on the notion that Russia posed a threat worthy of not just the continued existence of this political military alliance, but the expansion of this military alliance to the borders of Russia. Russia viewed this as unacceptable, and they had been communicating this reality to the collective West, to NATO, to the United States, and to Ukraine since 2008, when you know NATO was making noises about inviting Ukraine. Russia made it clear that they had red lines. These red lines were captured in a memorandum written by William Burns, then the ambassador of the United States to Russia, currently the director of the CIA. The memorandum was called "Niet means Niet," and no means no. And he said that Russia, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. Russia was saying that Ukraine will never be a part of NATO. This is a red line that if it's crossed, it will mean war. And William Burns predicted just that if NATO invites Ukraine, that it will inevitably lead to a military conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which will cost Ukraine territory. At a minimum, Crimea, remember this was written in 2008 prior to the 2014 Maidan coup. So he said, you'll lose Crimea and you'll lose the Donbass at a minimum. His predictions have become true. Russia wanted a settlement that would keep Ukraine out of NATO, and also where Ukraine, which was governed since 2014 by Ukrainian nationalists who um, basically were very anti-Russian in their in their domestic posture. These are people who came to power in 2014 with the goal of not only getting Ukraine on a trajectory to align itself with the West, but to suppress the pro-Russian sentiment that existed in the areas of Ukraine, eastern Ukraine primarily, that were dominated by ethnic Russians, people who not only spoke Russian but shared the ethnic ties with Russia. And this suppression bordered on, or sometimes crossed over into, outright cultural genocide, and one could even say physical genocide, given the violence that these Ukrainian nationalists used to impose their will on Russia. So the Russian military intervention was also to terminate this violence that had been ongoing since 2014 against the ethnic Russians of the Donbass. But the purpose of the military action was to get Ukraine to sit down at a negotiating table. And what we know is that less than a week after Russia invaded, they succeeded. The Ukrainians did sit down in a series of negotiations held in Gomel, Belarus, um, three negotiations, and then they transferred over in less than a month's time to Turkey, and it ended up with something called the Istanbul Communique being negotiated between the Russians and the Ukrainians that would have created the conditions of a lasting peace, one that saw Ukraine certify itself as a non-NATO neutral entity, and one that you know had the Ukrainians agreeing to respect the interests of the ethnic Russians. Um, it was too late for Ukraine to say that Donbass had to go back to 2014. Too much had transpired. Russia had already recognized the independent nature of Donbass, but they had not yet incorporated Donbass, the two, Donetsk and Lugansk, into Russia. So Russia was willing to have discussions with the Ukrainians about about referendum, so that the people of Donbass could decide which way they wanted to go. It was not a foregone conclusion. And Russia was also willing to have discussions with Ukraine about, while Russia wasn't willing to give up Crimea, to talk about Ukrainian interests in Crimea. Russia was willing to discuss these things. And Russia was willing to withdraw from all the territory that they had occupied around Kiev and the Sumy districts, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and return these to Ukrainian sovereign control. And so the scope and scale of Russia's military operation was built around this political objective. And everybody needs to understand that. Russia went in woefully undermanned if their goal was to conquer Ukraine. This was supposed to be, by design, a short-term military operation to achieve very specific political objectives that would hopefully be achieved in a reasonable time period, weeks, if not months. And Russia succeeded in doing this. They had the Istanbul Communique. It was ready to be signed. Russia was withdrawing troops from Kiev, from Sumy, from Chernihiv, and when they were preparing to withdraw troops from Kharkov, Kherson, Zaporizhia, as part of their, living up to their agreement. But the collective West, Great Britain, NATO, the United States, they saw Russia's gestures of good faith, not as signs of Russia being willing to, abide by commitments made, but as a sign of Russian weakness. And they have a overarching strategic objective of defeating Russia. And when I say defeating Russia, it's not that they plan on occupying Russia, defeating the Russian army on the battlefield. They want to defeat Russia economically through economic sanctions, and they want to defeat Russia politically by creating the conditions inside Russia conducive to domestic unrest that could lead to what the West calls a Moscow Maidan moment, where you would have the citizens of Russia, the citizens of Moscow, flooding the squares in Moscow, demanding that Vladimir Putin step aside, sort of repeating what happened in February 2014 when American-backed Ukrainian nationalists demanded the ouster of then Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. And so this was the objective. And so the United States and NATO began to flood Ukraine with money and military assistance designed to prolong this conflict. Knowing that Russia had stepped off with an inadequate force, they were hoping that Russia would overreact, go into a full-scale mobilization, an immediate transition into defense, into wartime defense production that would not only cripple a Russian economy straining under the weight of economic sanctions, but also break the spirit of a Russian people who would view the conflict in Ukraine as unwinnable and blame Vladimir Putin for getting them involved in a situation where they were suffering economically at home. But the Russians, didn't overreact. They everything is done by a phase. They realized that the first phase had not succeeded, although a lot of people don't realize that the Russians continued to negotiate in good faith with the Ukrainians up through June, even though the Ukrainians walked away from the agreement under the pressure of Boris Johnson, then British Prime Minister. Ukraine continued to participate in these elections. Now we know through Budanov, the head of Ukrainian intelligence, that they did this in bad faith, that they were leading the Russians to believe that there was still a chance for these negotiations to work. But what they wanted is for the Russians to further weaken themselves through these good faith efforts of withdrawing troops, not only from around Kiev, Chernihiv, Sumy, but also in the Kharkov region, where the Russians had in many places reduced their troop concentration by 50%, withdrawing troops back into Russia. The Ukrainians took advantage of this. Russia did refocus their effort on simply clearing Ukrainian forces out of the Donbass and securing the land bridge between Crimea and the Donbass. But Russia was still hoping that the Ukrainians would come to the table. Instead, Ukraine rebuilt their military using NATO money, NATO equipment, in many cases NATO mercenaries, and they launched a very effective counteroffensive in the fall of 2022, which succeeded in pushing the Russians out of much of the Kharkov area and pushing the Russians out of the right bank of Kherson. And Russia then had to go into another phase, another adjustment. And this adjustment required them to mobilize 300,000 forces and to begin the transition to, if not wartime, warlike military production. But this takes time. It takes months to mobilize and train soldiers properly and to make this transition. So they went into a third phase of what we call a frozen conflict. Many people in the West viewed this as a sign of Russian weakness, that Russia didn't have the strength to respond. And it led to, I think, a false sense of strength on the part of the Ukrainians and the West, who believed that if Ukraine could be reinforced even further, they could carry out a summer counteroffensive in 2023 that would break the spirit of the Russian army and generate the kind of domestic unrest that could lead to the removal of Vladimir Putin from power. And this, of course, was the infamous summer offensive. We saw what happened in the fields of Zaporizhia outside the village of Robotyno. We saw what happened elsewhere in and around Bakhmut. A catastrophic failure for the Ukrainians. The Russians had prepared for this counteroffensive, and they succeeded in defeating this counteroffensive. And now Russia has a decision, or made a decision, on what the next phase would be. And the next phase was predicated on what the Ukrainians wanted. Were the Ukrainians willing to accept reality on the battlefield, that they weren't going to win, they weren't going to evict the Russians, that Russia had absorbed these 4 territories through referendum in September 2022, and this was irreversible? Would Ukraine be willing to accept the reality as existed territorially and politically, that Ukraine would have to agree to be neutral? And the answer was no, under pressure from the West, who continued to believe that Russia was not capable of prevailing in this conflict. They wanted to extend this conflict into a forever conflict, one that would wear the Russians down over time. I don't think Russia wants to play that game, so Russia made the decision that they will now seek the strategic defeat of Ukraine, not just demilitarization, denazification, which were always objectives, but the strategic defeat of Ukraine and the collective West, which is the phase that we're currently in, where the Russians are building up their power. They are grinding down the Ukrainians. The goal is driven not by a calendar, but by objectives. The Russians are achieving measured results on the battlefield, consistent advances that also result in the destruction of Ukrainian manpower and equipment that can't be replaced. The Ukrainians are getting weaker. The Russians are getting stronger. A long time ago, I said that I thought after the successful mobilization of 300,000 reservists and the absorption of over 450,000 volunteers, that the Russians had changed the the military math equation away from one that was not favorable to them, the initial 200 plus thousand troops that had been involved, to one where they now were in a position with close to 600, 700,000 troops that they could not only retake the Donbass, but also expand, if necessary, into Kharkov or towards Odessa. But beyond that, the military power that Russia had, although considerable, wasn't capable of doing much more besides securing the Dnieper River line. We now see Russia engaged in a new wave of mobilization. Much of it, I believe, based not on mobilization of reservists, but mobilization of volunteers. The Russian nation has become gripped with a sense of patriotism, and we see Russians volunteering to serve in this conflict in very large numbers. And so much of this mobilization can be done through reserves. We see, for instance, Russia has yet to secure the Dnieper River line, and yet Russia is creating a flotilla, a Dnieper River flotilla, in anticipation of this. This flotilla is backed not just by ships, but by military units that are attached to it. And Russia is creating two new combined arms armies, which you would need if Russia is going to expand offensive operations beyond the Dnieper River line, for instance, into Odessa, securing a land bridge with Transnistria region, through Kharkov towards Sumy, securing Dnepropetrovsk, Mykolaiv. And this seems to be the direction that Russia is going. Russia has expanded its air operations, striking leadership targets, striking critical infrastructure targets. It appears to be an effort to destroy Ukraine's ability to continue to function economically and as a society. So Russia is seeking not only the military collapse of Ukraine, but the social, political, and economic collapse. And that's where we are today.
Yeah, it seems to me like the United States, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, 1992, the dissolution, that is to say, the elites running the United States sort of thought that at the time there were only really two countries on the Eurasian landmass that could ever pose a real threat. The first and obvious choice is obviously China, and the second is the Russian Federation. And in that regard, I guess they were, however you want to call them, neocons, the American deep state, so on and so forth, have been running this this scheme of politics where they were gradually going to push NATO and the EU, which, I mean, let's be frank, EU and NATO are the two gloves of the Euro-Atlantic Empire, the United States. They sort of wanted to, in my opinion, present the Russians with a fait accompli, like a done deal, and the Russians were essentially told to stuff it, accept it. The Baltic states, Poland, Czechia, Hungary, Slovakia, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, you have the Bucharest Summit, April 2008. They were going to bring in Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. Obviously, this was a red line for the Russians. And in regards to the conflict, I don't think the United States military or leadership, political leadership, were ever really ready to wage a real kind of land war against the Russians. So what they actually sought to do was engage the Russians and the Ukrainians against each other, initiate a coup in Ukraine, get the wrong kind of people in power in Ukraine, people that the Russians find, how can I say this, unacceptable, people who would not accept any kind of deal with the Russians, who impose a sort of unitary Ukrainian state, devoid of any Russian influence and so forth. But I guess this turned out into a complete disaster. Not only has the war effort of Ukraine failed with a lack of weapons, to say nothing of the manpower which Ukraine has lost. I don't see how Ukraine can bring any more men to the battlefield. But not only that, but the sanctions, it appears, have completely failed. And the sanctions have essentially cut off Russia from the SWIFT system, from the Western banking systems, from the United States and so forth, and everything that is related to the EU. And now what they've actually done is they've brought Russia closer to China and intertwined their economies. I mean, China is, and forgive me for speaking so long, I'm trying to reach a point here, a conclusion.
No, okay.
basically Russia is a resource exporter. It's a giant country. It's essentially bigger than Pluto. And China is manufactures goods with its industry. It needs resources. Who has the resources? Russia has the resources. And this is just like they ended up doing, in my opinion, the exact opposite of what they sought out to achieve. So what we now have is, I guess, the Russian military-industrial complex reawakening was already pretty large before the war. Now the Russians are, well, not, they've essentially cleared the dust out of all these ex-Soviet factories, which have been dormant for 30, 40 years, and they're churning out weapons day and night, day and night, day and night. And I guess we've reached the point, almost a breaking point, a watershed moment, as Americans would say, insofar as the war in Ukraine is concerned. Now, I wanted to ask you, what is your opinion on the summer offensive? For example, we've been talking about this for some time on various channels. You've been talking about it since 2022. I've been following you on YouTube for quite a few years now, almost 2 years. Do you think there is a reasonable chance that the Russians will initiate a summer offensive this summer, summer 2024? So what is the probability of that happening? Where do you think the Russians might end up, whether it's the Dnieper River or somewhere beyond? And what is the likelihood, in your opinion, since you are a military man in your own regard, you served within Western Germany, as far as I'm aware, during the Cold War. What is the probability of a NATO slash coalition of the willing, which almost implies by rule that everybody else in NATO is the coalition of the unwilling? For example, what is the probability of France, as Macron says, of France intervening in the conflict?
I think we start by pointing out that amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. That's just an old saying that is very accurate. So we can look at what Russia's doing logistically and try and project what Russia intends to do operationally. Logistically, Russia's military industry is being fully funded for expansive production for the next several years. I think through 2027 in some cases. We also see that logistically, Russia is building, as I mentioned earlier, 2 new combined arms armies, plus a Dnieper River flotilla, plus supporting units related to that. This means that Russia is preparing to carry out offensive operations that will, at a minimum, secure the Dnieper River line for Russia, and more than likely go on. Let's examine what are the top threats are to Russia today from Ukraine. The biggest threat comes out of Odessa region, the Black Sea, where Ukraine continues to project power in a way that hazards Crimea, hazards the Black Sea fleet. Russia needs to eliminate this threat. And that can only be eliminated when Russia seizes the city of Odessa and the Black Sea coast, that Ukraine loses access to the sea. We also see a peripheral threat emerging from the pro-Russian enclave in Transnistria, where we see Moldova, Romania, Ukraine all making noise about potential military engagement there. Russia has said that an attack against Transnistria is an attack against Russia and will be treated as such. But rather than leaving this problem there to be exploited by Russia's enemies, Russia will resolve this problem by securing a land bridge to Transnistria and incorporating that region into Russia. So I see that is definitely a major axis of advance for the Russians this summer, soon. I also see Russia becoming increasingly frustrated with Ukrainian military incursions and strikes against Belgorod and Kursk. So I see Russia needing to secure that border region as well. And in order to do that, I think Russia will, in order to simplify the military picture, will secure Kharkov as well. And so these are the 2 principal axes of advance that I see, in addition to continuing the pressure to drive to the Dnieper River line. I think the Dnieper River line is the objective of the current phase of operations, and then which are happening now. If you listen to the West, if you read the tea leaves, we are looking at the imminent collapse of the Ukrainian army and their ability to maintain a cohesive defense along the current line. And given their very dire manpower strait, they will have no choice but to withdraw to the Dnieper River line so that they can redistribute forces to the Odessa front and to the Kharkov Sumy front. And so that is happening as we speak. But once this happens this summer, as these new forces that Russia is preparing come online, I think you're going to see Russia carrying out, offensive operations in the Odessa sector and in the Kharkov Sumy sector, designed to, as I said, secure the land bridge with Transnistria and remove the threat that is posed to Crimea by Ukraine's presence on the Black Sea, and to eliminate the threat to Belgorod and Kursk by creating a cordon sanitaire, a buffer zone, so to speak, along the border between Russia and Ukraine there. And that means cleaning up the Kharkov region so that you have shortened, military lines. The longer your line of contact, the more troops you need. So Russia will be seeking to shorten their line. They'll take advantage of the Dnieper River also by putting in this Dnieper River flotilla that will secure the river, freeing up tremendous numbers of Russian forces that can be reallocated north and south. I think Russia's hoping that this will lead to the political collapse of the Zelensky regime, and that the Ukrainians will sue for peace on terms dictated by Russia. And therefore Russia will not have to carry out follow-on military operations, but Russia will be prepared to. If this collapse doesn't occur, then the next step is to isolate Kiev and secure the border with Poland, to terminate any ability of NATO to continue to supply, and to reduce the temptation of NATO to send in expeditionary forces, because that's the only thing that's left that Russia really needs to worry about. And they really don't need to worry about it because, again, logistics. Let's talk about the French for a second. The French have made noise. Macron speaks of there not being any red lines, but there are red lines, not necessarily established by Russia, but established by French reality. France currently maintains a reinforced battalion force in Romania, part of Operation Eagle. If when we're talking about a coalition of the willing, as you rightly pointed out, that means there's a coalition of the unwilling. That means that any forces that get sent into Ukraine will not be NATO forces. They will be forces of individual nations operating outside of the protective umbrella of NATO. The conflict, I'll go back in time to the early 2023 with when General Cavoli, the commander of NATO forces and U.S. forces in Europe, he spoke, I believe, at a Swedish defense forum, and at that time he said that that NATO had not imagined the scope and scale of the violence that's taking place in Ukraine, and that's an important statement to make, because understand that peacetime militaries train for operational contingencies linked to operational plans that are derived from the imagination of a threat. So you have planners who say, what would a deployment to, Romania look like in the face of a Russian threat? What would a conflict with Russia look like? How do we anticipate our forces to behave in contrast to Russian forces? What sustainability factors come into play? What do we need to have in terms of the initial echelon of forces? What kind of ammunition and fuel we have? Follow-on echelons need to be identified where they come in. So a plan is made based upon what we anticipate the war to look like and how we expect it to unfold. So when Cavoli says that what's happening in Ukraine was unimaginable. What he's saying is that NATO doesn't have a plan to deal with the reality of the level of violence. And this is a level of violence that will eat up a Western style brigade every 3 days. There aren't too many brigades in NATO capable of deploying. NATO has allowed itself to atrophy over the course of several decades of reimagination of what the NATO mission is. It stopped being able to wage large-scale ground combat in Europe. That was the NATO that I was familiar with in the 1980s that was singularly focused on this. Instead, it became a political military force designed to use the civil-military relationship as a way of absorbing Eastern Europe. So they were focused more on, questions of democracy and the relationship of the military with democracy, of making economic and political and judicial changes in Europe, a very political focus, as well as on how to project this political military model into the periphery of NATO. We saw NATO expanding into North Africa, starting to create partnerships there. We saw NATO talking about expanding into the Middle East, trying to create partnerships there. And then we saw NATO basically becoming a tool of, American national security and foreign policy. NATO allowing itself to be drawn into the Afghanistan conflict, although the relationship between Afghanistan and the North Atlantic is non-existent. But NATO instead found itself engaged in things that was never considered to be possible during the time of the Cold War. NATO was involved in offensive nation building, regime change operations in Libya. NATO was involved in a war in Europe by attacking Serbia and helping create the entity of Kosovo. These are operations that NATO as a defensive military alliance could never have considered during the time of the Cold War, but were being actively acted out now. But the military necessary for these operations is not the same military that was needed in the 1980s. First of all, when the Soviet Union collapsed, everybody, the United States, NATO, and everybody was looking for what they call the peace dividend. So they were looking to downsize, to restructure their military away from structures necessary to sustain large-scale ground combat into structures more conducive for expeditionary operations outside of Europe or within Europe in small modular brigade-sized deployments, such as what we saw in Kosovo. And when you restructure like this, everything gets restructured to include the basics: recruiting. The manpower requirements are different. The equipment is different. So you redefine your relationship with your respective military-industrial complexes. Politically, the financial aspect, what you expect of your military, how you fund your military, all of this changed. And then it was further complicated by America's singular focus on the global war on terrorism, where we just forgot about large-scale ground combat. To give you an example, in Europe, we withdrew all of our tanks, even the ones that we had in storage for rapid reinforcement. We withdrew them all. We didn't have any tanks left in Europe because we never envisioned a situation where we would need tanks in Europe. We stopped organizing for large-scale ground conflict. Instead, we were singularly focused on low-intensity conflict, counterinsurgency conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere. And every aspect of how America organized for war was geared on that. And suddenly we found, when the global war on terrorism ended, that we were not capable of doing anything else. And we are still in a transition period where we're trying to reorient our military to be able to carry out military operations against near peer and peer level opponents like Russia, like China. And we're not prepared to do that today. And so this is the reality that we're in. France is the same way. The French military today is a shadow of what it used to be. All militaries are. I mean, there was a time during the Cold War when I was in the Marine Corps that the British maintained 100,000 men in Germany called the British Army on the Rhine. Today, the German military or the British military is 72,000 strong and shrinking down to perhaps 56,000 in a couple days. You could put the entire British Army in a large soccer stadium and have 20,000 unsold seats. I mean, that's just the reality of how small the British Army. The German Army is no longer capable of deploying division-sized elements into the field. They struggle to deploy a reinforced battalion to Lithuania as part of the NATO battle groups. They struggle to try to expand that to a brigade-sized force. And the French are the same way. They shifted their military focus away from what they call high-intensity warfare to expeditionary warfare, where they were supporting deployments into Africa, into the Middle East, but not prepared to fight on the ground in Europe. And now Macron is trying to take this military and say that he's going to project power into Ukraine as a way of trying to stop the inevitability of a Russian military victory. He has this reinforced battalion in Romania. They were talking about reinforcing this to a reinforced brigade sometime in 2025. And so the French were beginning a process that takes about 2 years from envisioning to executing. And they were going to try and get a brigade deployed into Romania, but now they're talking about basically shortening the time frame, accelerating the process so that it can be done sometime this year. Logistically, it's extraordinarily difficult to do this, but even if you get the brigade into Romania and you build the logistics necessary to support that brigade in Romania, now to project that power in Ukraine is a whole level of difficulty that France is incapable of achieving. They don't have the logistics framework to do this. And Ukraine doesn't have the ability to absorb a French brigade and sustain it and continue doing what they're doing. So this is an operation that's far too complex for the French. But the other thing is 2,000 men means nothing, has no meaning on a battle. We're talking about a situation today where the Ukrainians are losing over 1,000 men a day. And so the French to deploy 2,000 men into this mix basically buys Ukraine 2 days, and then the French are gone. What do the French do when they lose 2,000 men? Do they reinforce to 12,000? There's some talk about creating a division-sized force that would deploy, but again, logistically impossible to do. They don't have the troops ready, equipped, trained. They don't have the logistic ability to push these forces into Romania, let alone push them into Ukraine and sustain them. But then that's 12 days of you bought the Ukrainians 12 days, and now all the French troops are dead. There's talk that France takes this step that other nations will follow, the coalition of the willing. The Baltic states will respond. But the Baltic states have no meaningful expeditionary capability. They might be able to provide a reinforced company of troops that have historically trained with the French and are familiar with French operational procedures and deploy them, but they'll be dead in a day. The Poles are talking about joining in. I think Macron is envisioning a 60,000 strong force that will somehow be allowed to situate itself inside Ukraine. And at that point in time, Macron would turn to NATO and say, we want to transform this force into a NATO force by citing Article 4, that we have a collective national security interest in securing Western Ukraine from the Russians. And then we bring in air power, provide a no-fly zone, etc. It's unrealistic thinking. They'll never get to 60,000. They'll all die beforehand, and Russia will never allow a no-fly zone. But what this is, if they push this issue, we now create a condition where Russia and NATO will be meaningfully engaged in high-intensity conflict. Russia will embarrass NATO at that point. And then the question is, can NATO take the embarrassment, accept the defeat, or will NATO seek to then transition this conflict into one where they start launching retaliatory strikes into the Russian strategic depth? And this is where it gets dangerous. Because, for instance, if they launch strikes against the Russian base at Ingles, where their strategic air power is located, that strategic air power is also part of the Russian strategic nuclear deterrent force. If they start striking command and control centers around Moscow, those command and control centers are a critical element of Russia's strategic nuclear deterrence. And Russia has said that if conventional power is applied in a way that seeks to degrade, diminish, or eliminate Russia's strategic nuclear deterrent, then Russia will use nuclear power in response. And now we're talking about a general nuclear conflict and everybody's dead. So this is the danger of the French initiative. And I'm hopeful that one, French generals will be telling Macron what they should be telling him, which is this is an unsustainable initiative on your part that will only lead to the defeat of France, strategic defeat of France. And I hope the United States is also starting to tell the French that we won't allow you to drag us into a larger conflict that can end with a nuclear exchange. And so I'm hopeful that NATO will not act on the fantasy of Emmanuel Macron, because it would only lead to a disaster for NATO, a defeat of NATO, and potentially a nuclear conflict. No power in Europe today can match the Russian military. It doesn't mean the Russians are perfect. They are capable of making mistakes. It doesn't mean that the Russians aren't suffering casualties. They are suffering considerable casualties. War is hell. But Russia has mastered the art of high intensity conflict, of large scale ground combat on a European theater. And more importantly than the tactics, operations, and strategic thinking of the Russian general staff and the Russian armed forces is the ability of Russia to sustain this conflict logistically, economically, and politically. Russia has brought all of the pieces necessary for this together. And I think the glue that holds it together is the fact that President Vladimir Putin received an overwhelming mandate for continued governance over the course of 6 years. The Russian people, the Russian nation are behind him, and so too is the Russian military. So I do believe that you're going to see significant changes. Let me finish with this. I had a conversation with Abdi Alidanov, who is a Chechen officer in the Russian National Guard. He's a general. He was just commander, I believe, of a corps in Lugansk. But he was pulled off the front lines sometime in February and sent to, or January, and sent to the Russian General Staff Academy, where he was two things. One, to receive specific training on the Russian style of warfare that would be conducive to greater responsibilities, and two, to impart the considerable knowledge that he had acquired about the realities on the battlefield to other Russian generals of similar rank. He has said that he anticipates that there will be major changes in the battlefield reality by May. And I think when he's talking about that, we're talking about the Ukrainians withdrawing to the Dnieper River line. And that appears to be the direction that we're heading. But he also said that Russia won't stop there, that he sees strategic changes occurring by the end of summer. And I think that these are the additional axes of advance that I've described. And so I think my assessment aligns with the thinking of somebody who is knowledgeable of Russia's strategic plans. And this isn't me giving away a confidential conversation. Abdi Alidanov repeated this in an interview given to Russian media. So I'm not sharing something out of school. I'm simply repeating something that a Russian general has already said in the open.
Okay, so yeah, it seems certainly, looking at the front lines, looking at Russia in the special military operation in Ukraine, that pretty much out of all the countries of NATO, certainly in Eurasia, maybe even the world, the army with the most amount of experience and combat-ready troops right now seems to be Russia. I mean, I don't rightly know what Macron or any other European leader would even try to attempt in Ukraine by putting, their troops in Ukraine. Aside from the fact that they would probably, this coalition of the willing, which almost by definition includes these three Baltic statelets, if I can call them that, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which I don't know if they combined have 4 million people. Poland almost as a rule always. Romania seems kind of hesitant. Now France is always, at least for the Baltic states, Poland is a good train to catch. And if it's a Western country like France, it's even better. But it seems like the elites, the political elites in the West, in NATO especially, are pretty much in panic mode. They're observing what has been happening over the past 2 years, especially over the course of from June 4th was it when the Ukrainians last year started their offensive into Robotino. This obviously went nowhere. They suffered terrible casualties. The West has been observing this. They've been they're just watching this entire thing collapse. It's falling into pieces like a fucking like a Lego piece. And forgive my language, but I've been observing this, and it's so much bloodshed. What I think this is what these people are attempting to do is they're at odds. The political leadership of NATO, of France, Germany, Poland, and so on and so forth, almost seems at odds with the military, establishment. And the military seems to be telling them, look, this is not going to work, right? They're trying to present to the Russians a new fait accompli, maybe fortify Western Ukraine on the west side of the Dnieper, divided on North Korean, South Korean lines. The Russians are not, South Korea. They're not North Korea. They're not going to accept this. They're a nuclear power. I mean, I don't think Macron is Macron is a person who talks a lot, but I don't think he's crazy enough to put French troops into Odessa or Kiev. I think it will be a disaster, personally.
I mean, one of the problems that we're facing here is that when I joined the Marine Corps, we were it was the Cold War, and the Soviet Union was the enemy, and we very much viewed them as the enemy. But we also operated under the notion that you needed to know your enemy as you knew yourself. And what I'm trying to get at is that today we see the West, collective West, infected with Russophobia, this fear and hatred of Russia. And it's not conducive to understanding the reality of Russia. Back in the 70s and 80s, even though the Soviet Union was our enemy, we studied the Soviet Union. I was a Russian history major in college, focused on Russian military history. I took the language imperfectly. Anybody who's heard me speak Russian understands that I don't claim to be fluent in the language, but I studied the language so that I could read Russian military texts, so I could read Russian literature. I read Russian literature to try and understand the Russian soul, to understand the Russian people, who they were. Who are these people that we're preparing to go to war with? What do they think like? What drives them? What motivates them? To study the economy of the Soviet Union, to see what makes it tick. We were, in many ways, Russophiles. You fell in love with your enemy, not meaning that you wanted to hug them, but you respected them. I respected the Soviets. I respected the Soviet military. I respected the Soviet people. I can't say I had perfect knowledge and understanding of them, but I was seeking to learn more about them so that I could accurately assess the situation and maybe even predict what they might be doing in a certain situation. I was surrounded. I was a junior officer at the time. I was actually brought in because of my background to participate in inspections of the former Soviet Union as part of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was signed by Reagan and Gorbachev in December of 1987. I was the first inspector on the ground in the former Soviet Union and sent there in the middle of June 1988 as part of an advance party to a Soviet missile factory in Votkинsk. On July 1st, the treaty came in force, and while inspectors were flying from Germany into Russia, I was already there. So you're looking at the first inspector on the ground in the Soviet Union. But that experience allowed me to see firsthand about the things that I only studied from afar. I got to meet Russians. I got to meet Soviet authority, meet the Russian military, meet the Soviet defense industry, to live amongst them, to learn about them. And what I'm trying to get at is I was surrounded by people like me who were more senior. I had colonels who spent these are guys who, all combat veterans from Vietnam who then made a decision to transition to what they call foreign area officer with a Soviet specialty because they were committed Cold Warriors. The Soviet Union was the enemy. But these are guys who, in order to become this, had to take formal language, become fluent in the Russian language, and then go on and get a advanced degree in topics related to Russia. Then they went to this unique facility called the United States Army Russia Institute in Garmisch, Germany, where they spent 1 to 2 years in an immersive environment where they had a village set up which was populated by Russian immigrants, where they only spoke Russian, where they did everything in the Russian language, using Russian cultures as if you were in Russia, so that you learn to think like the Russians. And then these guys went on to do jobs in the embassy as attachés. They were the military liaison mission in East Germany. They advised commanders. And these were expert advisors. And the State Department was the same way. The ambassador to the Soviet Union in the final years was Jack Matlock. Jack Matlock is one of the most respected Sovietologists. He's a man who spoke the Russian language fluently, who appreciated Russian culture, who loved the Russian people. He loved the Russian ways. But he was the American ambassador, and he represented, the United States in accordance with the policies that are being directed by, the president, by the State Department. But these were policies that were shaped by people who knew Russia, knew the Soviet Union, studied them. All of this went away when the Soviet Union collapsed overnight. It's like a new thinking came in, where they said, we don't want to have our minds polluted by people who are founded in the back, in the past. That they said, this is new frontier. We don't want Russia experts. We don't want experts on, the Russian soul. We want Russian exploiters. We want a new generation of people who can come in and not be in love with Russia, but be willing to, take over Russia, to exploit them. This is where you get people like Michael McFaul, who went on to become an ambassador, people like Fiona Hill, people like Angela Stent. These are people who aren't experts in Russia. These are people who are experts in how America sought to exploit Russia politically, economically. The decade of the 1990s redefined a whole new generation of so-called Russia experts, but their expertise was not trying to live in peace and harmony with an equal power, but how to exploit politically, economically a defeated power. Our goal was to keep Russia down, keep them down permanently, to even rip them apart. But and we almost succeeded. I mean, any Russian who lived through the decade of the 90s understands what a catastrophe it was for Russia. One of the worst things that's happened to Russia since the end of the Second World War. And in some cases, even worse, when you want to talk about the actual damage done to Russia in terms of demographics, economics, etc. In 1999, the end of 1999, Boris Yeltsin, his last act was to appoint Vladimir Putin to be his replacement. And Vladimir Putin was a man who was not willing to become Yeltsin 2.0. That was the goal of the United States. All of the real Russia experts, people like, I'd like to put myself in their category, myself, Jack Matlock, etc., were saying that, listen to Putin. Putin is talking about what's in the best interest of Russia. But we were never cared what's in the best interest of Russia. We cared how we could exploit Russia to the best interest of the United States and NATO, an expansive NATO designed to bring Russia down. And so we began this cycle of conflict that's well known. We see the United States trying to bring Russia down. We see Vladimir Putin trying to build Russia up, and it led to a series of clashes that are well defined. There's well defined points in this 2005 speech that Vladimir Putin gave to the Russian Federal Assembly, where he said, that the collapse of the former Soviet Union was one of the greatest catastrophes in modern history. And everybody stopped there and said, that means Vladimir Putin is seeking to rebuild the Soviet Union. But see, somebody who truly studies Russia would say, but what he said next is the most important, because overnight tens of millions of Russians became homeless, and that he, as the Russian president, was responsible for the Russian nation, and the Russian nation was greater than just the borders of the Federation, but incorporated people with shared cultural values, history, language, traditions, religion, all of this. Nobody listened to that because we no longer had Russian experts. We had people who were expert on exploiting Russia, and Putin had become an impediment to the continued exploitation. And then we see 2007, when he speaks at the Munich Security Conference, and what he said there, amazingly saying that Russia will not tolerate this. We see the Russian responses after the expansion of NATO in 2008. We see Putin, speaking about the absorption of Crimea. We see Putin speaking about the need to build nuclear, redefine Russia's strategic nuclear deterrence in the face of America's withdrawal from treaties, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the intermediate nuclear forces treaty, and we see the statements made by Vladimir Putin justifying the special military operation. All of these statements were listened to by people who provide advice to US presidents, to French presidents, to British prime ministers. But these aren't Russian experts. The people giving advice to the leadership today are people who seek to exploit Russia, to keep Russia down, but they're not experts in Russia. Therefore, everything they see in Russia is misconstrued, misunderstood, misinterpreted. And so they actually believed that they could impose sanctions on Russia and do harm. Any expert in Russia, and I count myself in this, I predicted this before the sanctions were imposed in papers that were written in November, December of 2021, that if we sanction Russia, it will backfire because we don't understand the economic linkage that's taking place and we don't have a plan B. But what we will be doing for Russia, one of the enduring problems that Vladimir Putin faced as the president of Russia is what to do about the oligarch class. He inherited from Boris Yeltsin. Russia's not a dictatorship. He can't just snap his finger and make them go away, because there would be dire economic consequences. He had to learn to work with them, to adapt, and over time. But he always ran into this problem of there being about 20 to 30% of Russian society that was thoroughly enmeshed with the West, and you couldn't divorce the two. It was there. The West was hanging around like this weight around Russia's neck, and you couldn't divorce it because that would lead to, a political catastrophe. Vladimir Putin didn't win elections prior to this recent one by, he tended to win, 58%, 53%, maybe 61%. But if you create the conditions where you lose 30% of the electorate, the pro-Western electorate, by a precipitous divorce with the West, Vladimir Putin could be voted out of office. And he's smart enough to know that you can't do that. So he tolerated this linkage to the West because he had no choice. It was the West that created the conditions of divorce. And one of the things that we did that nobody in the West understands is that we freed him from the oligarch class. We liberated Vladimir Putin. We liberated Russia. And that's one of the reasons they've been able to do this tremendous economic turnaround, because now he can redirect economic, focus, et cetera, in ways that he couldn't when the oligarchs were there putting their demands on him. Now he can do that. Russia's reinvesting in Russia. Russia's able to focus on things that are best for Russia, not best for Western interests. And we're seeing a total, revitalization of Russia as they pivot away from the West towards China, towards India, towards the global South. Russian experts saw this. They could forecast it. All the people advising Macron, advising Biden, advising whoever the prime minister of the day is in Great Britain, advising Schultz. These aren't real Russian experts. These are people who I call Putin whisperers, who have spent their entire lives focused on one man and one man only, Vladimir Putin, misrepresenting his history, misrepresenting his goals, his objectives, and not understanding Russia in the process. And as a result, they give advice that are based upon things that are never going to happen, such as a Moscow Maidan. There's no real Russian expert today who believes that a Moscow Maidan could happen. It's just impossible. And yet they continue to believe that if they do X, increase sanctions, if they do Y, increase the cost of war, that they will get, Z, a collapse of Russia. They're misrepresenting this. They're totally off base. And now, the proof is in the pudding. It's all come to a head. And there's a realization now across the collective West that they got it wrong. And now they're realizing the consequences of getting it wrong, which is they are losing on every single front: the economic front, the diplomatic front. Russia is more popular today in the world than at any other time. Their diplomats are securing tremendous diplomatic victories in Africa and the global South. Russia is a loved nation, not a feared nation, not a hated nation. Economically, Russia is very strong. In terms of domestic politics, Russia's never been stronger. And as you pointed out, militarily, there is no nation on the earth that can wage war on a scope and scale that Russia does, with the expertise that Russia brings to the table. And it's not just about the weapons. It's not just about the combat experience in terms of tactics, operations, and strategic thinking. It's the logistics of war. Russia has mastered the logistics of war. No other nation can do what Russia is doing, because war isn't just about winning that first battle on the battlefield. If you win that first battle but lose too many casualties or use up all your ammunition, that second battle, you'll be defeated and you lose the war. Russia's about winning the war. And there's no other nation on the earth today that has the combination of factors. Because again, I remind you, war is an extension of politics by other means. So you can't view the military in isolation. It has to be backed up by a larger system. And in the case of the Russian military, it's backed up by an economic system, a political system that is united, stronger today than it has ever been in modern history. And that's now linked to this military system that is, frankly speaking, undefeatable.
Yes, it certainly seems like the Russians are on the march, and it's frankly thanks to the United States and NATO as a whole and their policies
Yeah.
towards Russia. It almost seems like there was an attempt at balkanization of Russia through sanctions, through, you know, working with oligarchs, pressure on the battlefield, and so on. A Russian Moscow Maidan was supposed to, in their minds at least, bring down Russia, tear it apart, disillusion the military, disillusion the people, break it up into constituent republics, and make sure it never ever rises again, and essentially use it as a giant, resource farm for extraction for European countries and the United States. But I wanted to go back into like the war itself. How much time do you think Ukraine, in your estimation, has? How much time until Ukraine begins to collapse? I mean, Colonel Douglas McGregor, I've also frequented his shows and interviews on YouTube. He is of the opinion, and he constantly talks about this quote. He says, things go on until they can't. Now, I'm quoting him, quoting someone else. I can't remember who exactly it was that said this, but in your opinion, is this going to reach a breaking point? Is this going to reach a like Germany 1918 moment where, the front line is there, things go on, they go on and go on and go on, and then suddenly just one day everything just collapses?
Well, that's what collapse is. It's where you maintain. When we speak of the military, it's a system. So you have troops at the front line who are doing their job, but they have to be backed by supporting fires, logistics, communications, intelligence, and all that has to be backed up by command staffs that are linked to political decision-making centers, that are linked to economic centers of gravity, political centers of gravity, linked to a nation itself. And in order to sustain cohesive presence at the front line, all this other stuff has to be working. And if you are a professional military in a nation, you've built in a certain amount of resilience. You understand that there will be losses, not just on the front line, but throughout the rear. So if a decision-making center is taken out, you have a plan B. It transitions to this one. If that's taken out, you have a plan C. And that's how you can survive in a war where casualties are heavy and inevitable. You can go through, you can maintain a presence at the front and still be attrited in the rear, and it looks like you have a system that's working. But anybody who's been in the rear area knows what happens when communications get cut. You now have to take resources and reestablish communications. That diminishes resources available. Logistics are cut down. You lose fuel. You have to take resources, acquire new fuel. That diminishes your resources. And at some point in time, you become resource restrained. You don't have any more resources. So as emergencies occur, you have to, in order to solve that emergency, you have to prioritize functionality and start shutting down functionality, divert resources to get this back up and running. And now you start to see capacity decline. And you see that at the front and you see that in the rear. What the Russians have been doing is wearing the Ukrainians down on the totality of their combat capacity. And you see them now turning up the pressure on the economic aspect of it and on the political aspect of it with the way that they're doing their targeting in terms of the strategic air campaign. There's this game, I forget what it's called, Zynga or something, but it's the blocks, the big tower of building blocks. And, a whole bunch of people just sit there. And at first, the tower is pretty solid, and you start removing pieces. And that's what I'm talking about. That tower is the ability to continue to resist. You start moving pieces. There's a semblance of structure there. You keep removing pieces. There's a semblance of structure. It still exists. It's defeating gravity. You keep removing pieces. It's there. But there will come a point where you remove that last piece and the whole thing comes down. And that's where we're at right now. There's no more pieces for the Ukrainians to remove. They're out of pieces, and the West isn't providing them replacement pieces, because that's what was happening before. Russia was removing pieces, then the West would come in and replace pieces. So, even though Russia was, wearing them down, pieces were putting in sustainability. But when you cut off the sources of replacement pieces and you start removing pieces at a rate far greater than Ukraine can replace them, you get to a situation where eventually you're going to take out that last piece and the whole thing tumbles down. That's where we're at right now. There are no more replacement pieces. And sooner or later, we can't predict it. You always know that part. If you played the game, it's always, that last part, tick, 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 and everybody, oh, it stayed up. Good job. The next person. And so everybody's hopeful that it's going to stay up until eventually, tick, 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 boom. But you don't know when it's going to happen. Just know that it's going to happen. And that's where we're at right now. We're waiting for that last piece to be removed. And that's it. There's a chance that, $300 million package will be provided here that slides into peace that prevents collapse for another week. $1 billion is found here. 2 more pieces, keeps it going for another month. But eventually, those pieces are gone. The last piece hit and collapsed. So I'm with Colonel McGregor. We are looking at, it's there until it isn't. We're looking at a situation where that last block of wood is going to be pulled out, and Ukraine's going to come tumbling down like the broken structure that it is.
It seems almost like we're reaching. It's almost on the horizon already. The war in Ukraine and the breaking point, like the breaking point of the Ukrainian state as a whole, the system, and the military. Yeah, but as you said, it cannot properly be estimated. Another question related to Ukraine. Recently, Victoria Nuland resigned. She was the 3rd highest ranking US diplomat in the United States, and she was then resigned, more like forced into resignation, I suppose, replaced by another career diplomat, John Bass, who was a former ambassador to Afghanistan. Does this, in your mind, constitute... does this seem like the establishment, the deep state, the hawks, or shifting the pieces inside and sort of switching from one failed project and going on to the next? They're like, okay, there goes, that plan about Ukraine. Let's put a China hawk in, John Bass, who's let's start something about Taiwan. Does this seem like Victoria Nuland's resignation and her replacement? Does it seem to you like the pieces are shifting in Washington?
Well, I mean, look, Victoria Nuland, we should never diminish the role that she played. She was an architect of the current Ukraine policy. She's the person that got us here. And she had been promoted within the State Department to where she was the principal, architect of the current policy as well. She was an acting Deputy Secretary of State. And I think she was hopeful of that promotion to get it. But instead, they put somebody else in that position. And you have to ask yourself why. The person they replaced her with, whose name escapes me right now, was also a China hand. That was his focus. Why would the United States be shifting away from Ukraine and Russia towards China at this juncture? And I think the answer is domestic American politics. We're at a situation right now where Ukraine has become a political hot potato. It's been caught up in issues pertaining to the security of the southern border of the United States, and the funding now is trapped in a political battle. It's linked to funding for the border. It's linked to policy changes in the border that Joe Biden is not in a position to make. Because this is an election year. He can't look to be weak. He can't do policies that are being demanded by his opponent, Donald Trump. And so if he doesn't make the changes, then the Republicans don't release the Ukraine fund, the Israeli funding, the Taiwan funding. So there's this game being played. And I think the Biden administration also understands that they don't want to be overseeing a strategic defeat of Ukraine come in the week leading up to the November election. That they need now, for political reasons, this Ukrainian conflict to be resolved. They need a diplomatic off-ramp. And Victoria Nuland was the opposite of that. She was about doubling down. She was about staying the course. And so I think what happened is they made a shift, and she was not willing to make that shift. And she made demands, and these demands could not be met. And I think the combination of I think that when they appointed somebody else as the Deputy Secretary of State, she realized that she had lost that battle when she tried to continue to articulate aggressively. There was pushback, and she realized there was no place for her left, so she resigned. And now she has her sinecure at Columbia University, where she will speak to the Council of Foreign Relations and go on TV and have advisory, but she's out. They've replaced her with, as you had mentioned, Ambassador Bass, who is best known for overseeing the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan in the summer of 2021. And I think that he's well positioned to oversee the withdrawal of the United States from Ukraine in 2024. And I think that's the direction that we're heading.
So you foresee very likely an American and NATO backing off from Ukraine. Okay, that's interesting.
They have no choice. I mean, the thing is, they're in an unsustainable position. I think, again, because they're surrounded by experts, all of the decision makers right now, none of them are genuine Russian experts. You can't identify a genuine Russian expert. You can identify people who have built their academic career, their professional career on opposing Vladimir Putin. But even then, they're not experts on Putin. They just have created this artificial reality surrounding Putin. But they have no genuine insight into the Russian thinking. We have a Russian ambassador in the United States, Anatoly Antonov, who, he's been there now for 7 years. He's a genuine expert on the United States. He is somebody who is a specialist on arms control. He helped negotiated the New START treaty with the United States back in 2010. He is surrounded by Russian diplomatic professionals, all experts in the United States, who are ready to sit there and start talking with the United States, but nobody's talking to them because we have no interest in having good relations with Russia. We want Vladimir Putin gone. Therefore, why go through the artifice of good relations? And so, we have people who are flying blind on Russia. And right now, these people are desperately looking for an off-ramp, but an off-ramp implies a solution. You can't solve a problem that has never been adequately defined. If you don't correctly define the problem, any solution you are trying to come up with to that incorrectly defined problem isn't really solving the problem. It's solving something else. And so we have people looking for an off-ramp out of this Ukraine conflict. But the problem that they're defining, the problem upon which they're deriving political options, isn't the reality of the problem. If they would sit down and talk to the Russians, they would understand that the Russians don't have a tremendous amount of flexibility on this issue, and that's the reality, and that the West needs to adapt to that reality. What's happening is that we refuse to adapt to that reality, and so reality is catching up with us, and we're now in a very panicked state because we, as analysts, are the people who are advising. They are unable to adequately predict the future because they don't have a solid enough understanding of the present reality, and it's going to lead to disaster. I mean, we are looking at a situation where Ukraine is going to collapse like a house of cards, and then the West is going to be sit there looking at the reality of no more Ukraine. I'm not talking about a limited. I'm talking about Ukraine no longer existing. That is a real option here, and then the West will be struggling out on how to deal with it. But at that point in time, I actually think the situation becomes clear because we no longer have to worry about this artificial entity called Ukraine. We have to deal with a new reality called Russia. At that point in time, the phones are going to be picked up. People are going to start to talk. Antonov will become a real ambassador, meaning that they really start to talk, because they have no choice at that point in time. This fake problem of Ukraine will have been removed, and now they have to deal with the real problem of Russia.
Yeah, it almost seems like the conflict in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, is bound to end up more like Vietnam than Korea, with the Russian
Yeah,
with
yeah,
the Russian
absolutely.
army breaking out basically into Lvov, onto the borders of Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, which is bound to cause cold sweat, outbursts of cold sweat in Warsaw, Berlin, um, Washington as well. But I wanted to ask you, in shifting the subject, I'm interested in Taiwan. Now, I don't know how acquainted you are, but it seems almost as if in the past 2, 3, 4 years that the relations between Beijing and Washington have deteriorated somewhat, especially under President Biden, and that not only is the Biden administration not willing to acquiesce to basically not even to negotiate with Russia, they're openly lying to Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership. They're saying one thing and then doing another. In regards to Taiwan, now we get reports. What was it? 2 weeks ago, a week ago, of American special forces on Taiwan Island. Not even on Taiwan Island, on one of the tiny islands off the coast of mainland China, which is what 5 kilometers less from the Chinese coast. I mean, this is nobody in their right minds think these what is it 200 people 300 less that these guys have any chance of actually stopping the People's Liberation Army should they choose to land. It's more a tripwire. These poor bastards are going to get killed, and then the United States, the president is going to come to the Senate and he's going to be saying, well, we have to respond. China is an aggressor. Taiwan is an independent state. Even though there are 3 communiques between the PRC and the United States. The United States switched recognition in 1971 under, what was it, Nixon. Even the UN seat went from the Republic of China, which is based out of Taipei, Taiwan, to the PRC, the People's Republic of China in Beijing. So my question to you is, what do you see in the next, this year, next year, in the next few years? How would this end up spiraling out of control? Is it a possibility that there would be a conflict over the Taiwan Straits, over Taiwan Island itself, and the key industries which Taiwan Island holds? For example, the microchip industry, which produces microchips for cars, microwaves, fridges, GPUs, everything. What is your opinion on what's the likelihood of a conflict over it?
Well, there's a couple things. One, China in the Republic of China, People's Republic of China, in its constitution, speaks of the desire for peaceful reunification. That's their priority. Curiously, in the most recent meetings of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping and then senior Chinese officials have dropped peaceful from their discussion of unification. And so what they're doing is sending a signal that if Taiwan continues down the current course, that when unification comes, it will not be peaceful in nature. It will be through military means. But I think that's posturing. It's backed up by the reality. I mean, we see the Chinese military preparing for the eventuality of having to take Taiwan by force if Taiwan continues down the current trajectory it has of transitioning from a de facto independence into actual independence. But there was an election last year in Taiwan, a very important. I mean, actually earlier this year, and the election was not just for the presidency, but for the Taiwan legislative body. The presidency was won by the incumbent party, which the party is very pro-independence, very pro-America. They're the ones who have initiated this close military relationship with the United States, etc.
You're talking
We
about
had
the
this party,
DPP, right? The
correct?
Democratic Progressive Party.
And if they had won the legislative body, I think we'd be looking at war in the very near future before the end of this year. But they didn't. The legislative body was won by, the majority of seats were won by the Kuomintang party, and then also I think it's the Taiwan People's Party, TPP. And these two parties are not in favor of the pro-independence route taken by the incumbent, and so they are actually working on improving economic relations with China, improving political relations, taking a completely different track. And given the fact that the executive power in Taiwan is not absolute, that the prerogatives of the executive are linked to the willingness of the legislative body to endorse these policies. And when it comes to writing laws, we're seeing Taiwan at it's sort of a deadlock, so to speak. And so I think this reduces the possibility of conflict, because I think you'll see that China will be working with these two elements to shape Taiwanese policy. There's a lot of posturing taking place. I think the Taiwan president gets sworn in May, I believe, when the new president comes in. And so you see a lot of posturing by China right now, like I said, eliminating the term peaceful from their policy statement on unification, just as a signal to the Taiwanese president about what the future will be. But the one thing is that neither side wants the economic consequences of conflict. Taiwan enjoys the high standard of living that they have. China, likewise, is seeking not to absorb a destroyed state, but a state that is is a multiplier in terms of China's overall economic posture. So, war is not really an option that anybody wants. And now that I believe that the Taiwanese domestic political reality is such that you don't have an executive capable of making unilateral decisions backed by a compliant legislative body, but instead you have a series of checks and balances where any initiative by the executive will be checked by the legislative body. I think you're going to see for the next 4 years China seek to exploit this division and undermine support for the incumbent party, for these Taiwanese nationalists, independent-minded people. And the United States, there's really nothing the United States can do, because treaties, any agreements we have to be agreed upon by both the executive and the legislative body. And the legislative body isn't going to rubber stamp, new expanded relations with the West. They're actually seeking to bring back or to implement, some economic treaties and understandings that were negotiated back when the Kuomintang held the presidency, back I think in 2014 or so. So I'm confident that void of any precipitous action by either Taiwan or the United States, that we're not headed towards war. And here's the other reality: the United States can't fight a war against China. We can't. Just like we can't fight a war against Russia. We don't have the military capability to do it. It's unsustainable. Our Navy can't project the power in a meaningful way against the force structure that China has arrayed. You talk about, I think it's Quemoy and Matsu. It might be the island of Quemoy or Matsu, where the U.S. Special Forces have deployed. It's a nothing burger, meaning that the Chinese really don't care other than the politics of it. The United States isn't looking for a tripwire. I think last year there was a situation where we sailed through the Taiwan Strait between Taiwan and China. There's an American warship together with a Canadian warship, and the Chinese moved aggressively, responding, threatening to ram the ship, etc., because the Chinese believe that because Taiwan is China, there is no right of international passage through the Taiwan Strait, because it's not an international shipping route, it's sovereign waters. And so the United States had to be confronted with the fact that if they continue to force this issue, there will inevitably be a situation where an American ship receives damage, and then the United States will have to do something. Then they turn to the war gamers in the Pentagon who say every time we run this scenario, boss, we lose. We don't just lose a little, we lose dramatically. It's a strategic defeat. And that's what the military is telling the president, that if you push this thing too far and we begin a process of, military escalation, we never win. There's no scenario where we do win realistically. There are war games that have been done where they've come in and they've tweaked the system a little bit, giving America more capability than it has, giving the Chinese less capability. And in those cases, it comes out to a draw. But the reality is, if there is a war between China and the United States over Taiwan, the United States will lose strategically. We can't win. And that means that Taiwan will be captured by the Chinese, but it will be destroyed in the process. That's an outcome that, the United States is aware of. And believe it or not, the Taiwanese political elite are aware of, both those in favor of better relations with China and those who are, in favor of pursuing this drive to independence. They know what the outcome is. And there's not anybody right now that's suicidal. So I think that while there's going to be a lot of posturing, at the end of the day, the lack of ability to follow through on a policy that leads to military confrontation, the guarantee of a negative outcome for the United States and Taiwan is probably the best chance we have of sustaining peace, because they know that if they initiate something, they're going to lose.
I'm of the opinion that, in the event of a war between the United States and the People's Republic of China over Taiwan Island, I mean, basically the United States Navy bases in Okinawa or not, or in Japan, right? The rest of Japan. The United States is essentially projecting influence across thousands and thousands and thousands of kilometers of open ocean. And just last summer, there were reports of the Pacific Command of the United States Navy essentially panicking that they're running out of ATACMS missile ammunition and whatnot, which were essentially primarily meant as a safeguard against the PRC, the PLA, whatever. It almost seems like a suicide mission. And if the United States Navy can maybe, push its ships through the Taiwan Straits one more time, two more times. I don't know how long the Chinese, the political leaders of the PRC will allow for this to happen again. But be that as it may, should a war between the US and the PRC occur over Taiwan Island, obviously the logical outcome would be that Taiwan Island would essentially be flattened, leveled in the combat and the fighting, the bombings and so on, because the PRC can isolate it, they can institute an air blockade, a naval blockade, and so on and so forth. There's not a whole lot the United States can do there, but the question arises, would the United States leadership, cynical as it is, push this thing maybe to a war, not for the purpose of a win against China per se, but if for no other reason than to portray China as an aggressor, and then to institute a blockade, a sort of naval blockade, as ridiculous as that sounds, of the US Navy blockading mainland China, which is kind of a ridiculous statement because the United States Navy is smaller and is projecting influence across open ocean for thousands of kilometers, and then instituting sanctions against China, whose economy is based on export of finished goods. So how feasible is this happening? Do you think it's a possibility somehow that some people in Washington, hawks of some kind, would want to initiate a conflict, regardless of the will of the residents and the politicians of Taiwan, to start a war, portray China as an aggressor, just like Russia and Ukraine, and then sanction China, destroy its economy, and so destroy the social contract between, the citizens of China and the Chinese government itself? The social contract is, the economy is good, we obey. The economy is not good, we do not obey. You lose the mandate of heaven, which is sort of the founding principle of Chinese authority, Chinese government. And in such a way, threaten the existence and the governance of the CCP itself.
Well, that sounds like a Moscow Maidan moment, doesn't it? But it's a Beijing Maidan moment. It's unrealistic. It shows a total lack of understanding of the realities of the Chinese domestic condition. It's a theory that's put out by the The people I call Putin whisperers, I will call them Xi whisperers, people who have no understanding of China, no understanding of how China works, what makes China function, the economic reality of China's being. We don't understand it. We have a class of American Chinese experts that grew out of the decade of the 1970s and 80s, where we talked about a one China policy, but we didn't mean it. We never meant it. As soon as we agreed to it, we have presidents running around signing findings and statements that say we didn't really mean that. We went along with it because we thought that by introducing China to capitalism, that would be the end of communism. We believed that there would be a transition away from it. And therefore, we stopped studying Chinese communism. We stopped studying Chinese reality. We were waiting for something to emerge that we would shape, we would define. And that never emerged. And so we have an entire class of Chinese experts who are experts on nothing, just like our Russian experts on nothing. They don't know anything about the reality of China. They don't know how China operates. They don't know the keys to Chinese economic success. We have people who can say, oh, well, supply lines, supply chains, manufacturing based, this, that, and the other thing. It's not how it works. It's the Chinese have a system that we need to understand, and it's far more complex and actually in many ways far more simple than what we try to overlay on them. But the Chinese are not going to play the American game. China. First of all, how do you sanction a nation that is that has borders with not just Russia, but the Eurasian hinterland, a new Silk Road with connectivity to places west, including Europe? How do you sanction? How do you blockade that? You can't. Not only that, as you seek to blockade, remember that China has built missile systems that will sink every ship in the United States Navy. So we can't sustain the blockade. U.S. policy towards China that is being driven by these hawks is a policy that's not based in reality. It's not based in economic reality. It's not based in a reality of China's internal domestic situation. It's not based in the geopolitical reality. I mean, we are talking about a world that is transitioning from an American singularity to a multipolarity. But American policy is premised that we still will have the rules-based international order in place where the United States is calling the shots. That's not the case. That time has passed. And so I think that a lot of these policy options that people are putting out there it's just fanciful. That's like already starting to build a city on Mars before we even got somebody to go to Mars. We don't know if we can even get to Mars, but people are planning cities. Talking about China in the way that the conservatives are talking about is absurd because it's not based on reality. The Chinese reality is that China is a far more dynamic, far more resilient, far more capable nation than these naysayers in the West want people to believe.
Right. I'm of that opinion as well. You mentioned this, and I forgot to ask this in the previous question. I was going to say, I mean, in the event of such an unrealistic conflict over Taiwan between the U.S. and the PRC, the U.S. Navy and the Japanese Navy would essentially be operating in it's basically Chinese coastal waters. Air Force. I mean, it's true. The Chinese Air Force, the Chinese missile systems, the land-based army, the Navy, all of these. It's ridiculous to even consider. But as the Chinese saying goes, may you live in interesting times, and in interesting times we live. We've come to the point where we actually have to consider whether this is actually a possibility, maybe, of actually happening. But it seems almost that the Xi Jinping, the president of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, over the past 10 years, 12 years, he's instituted this Belt and Road Initiative, which essentially is a land-based corridor, a new Silk Road through Eurasia, from China, from the industrial regions of China and the industrial Chinese hinterland over through Central Asia, into Russia, Belarus, and onwards into Europe. So this conflict, that should it happen, is likely to, and should the United States impose sanctions on China, well, not only, sure, it'll hurt China probably in the short term, damage its economy. But I guess what I'm trying to say is eventually it'll lead to nothing but nothing but trouble. Probably would, disqualify, discredit the United States internationally, economically, should they choose to do this. But I guess we'll see. I'm hoping for a KMT victory in the future, maybe even a presidential victory in the next round of elections in 4 or 5 years. Hopefully, we'll see a peaceful integration, because I don't see how, in the multipolar world, how an independent Taiwan state slash ROC could ever exist outside of the confines of the Chinese state. But I'm sorry. Do you have any more time? Am I being? Is this gonna cut off?
Unfortunately, we have about 5 more minutes, and then I have to go.
Okay, okay. Let me just ask you one last, or like one or two last questions. Sort of gonna push them together, and then you can give me your opinion, and we can end this. It's basically about NATO influence in the Balkans specifically. So today is March 25th, 2024. Yesterday was March 24th, 2024. It is exactly 25 years since NATO aggression against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia at that time, basically Serbia and Montenegro today. One of these states today is a NATO statelet, vassal state, puppet state, call it what you will. Montenegro was forcibly integrated in 2017 into NATO. I'm interested in your opinion on NATO and NATO influence, that is to say, Euro-Atlantic integrations, aspirations in the Balkans, and then how do you see the future, for example, of the two crucial states, or attempts of a state, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and air quotes, Kosovo? And how do you see NATO as an organizational structure developing in the future? Does NATO have a future, in your opinion?
You know, the disintegration of Yugoslavia was something that where these states emerged from: Serbia, Bosnia Herzegovina, Croatia, Slovenia, Montenegro, Macedonia. These are all former parts of the former Yugoslavia. The disintegration of Yugoslavia was a purposeful event by the Western European political elites and economic elites in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union to try and head off problems. The idea was to go in there and eliminate Serbian nationalism as this poison in Europe, and NATO became the military arm of the European a European-driven policy of doing this. Left to its own devices, NATO, backed by the European Union, I believe, would be successful in creating the appearance of absorption. I mean, you're never going to resolve the underlying, Serbian nationalism. But I would say that if it weren't for what's going on in Ukraine, that if Russia wasn't a problem, that Serbia would be sucked into NATO via the European Union, meaning that the allure of the European Union would be too much for Serbia to resist. Serbia would seek to join the European Union, and in the process, begin a process that led to eventual NATO membership. That NATO was resilient enough to accomplish this European task. But NATO has bitten off more than it can chew. NATO has collapsed in Afghanistan. NATO is suffering a strategic defeat in Ukraine. And NATO has shifted its primary focus away from resolving the former Yugoslavian problems, and now dealing with the demands that are being put out there by the Baltic states, by Poland, this focus on Russia. And as a result, you're seeing that Serbia is becoming more and more they're growing a backbone when it comes to standing up to the European Union and to NATO. I think the Serbian president yesterday gave a very forceful speech where he said, "We will never be members of NATO. We will never join NATO." I also believe that NATO's on a trajectory of eventual dissolution. I don't think NATO can survive what's happening in Ukraine. I think the divisions that arise within Europe, the fractures that already exist in the European Union, will become more manifest. and I think you're going to see the disintegration of NATO politically and militarily. It's too expensive for Europe. Can't afford, under its current economic condition, can't afford to build a military necessary to make NATO a viable counterweight to Russia's military. Finland and Sweden are going to find that a lot more pressure is going to be put on them to do things that they assumed that a NATO alliance would provide, that they're going to have to self-fund, they're going to have to build up capabilities, and it's going to bankrupt them. They don't have the money to do it. Germany can't maintain the 2% funding requirement, and that's just to sustain their military, let alone grow it, as Schultz and others have spoken of. France is looking at a situation where they're going to be compelled to have further military reductions because they can't afford to keep up this military spending. All parties are going to be doing that. The United States is going to find itself hamstrung by a commitment to a strategic nuclear deterrent revitalization program that's going to just suck money out of everything. And they won't be able to maintain the kind of conventional power necessary to be a meaningful member of NATO, at least a meaningful member that NATO is used to, where America is called upon to solve all problems and provide most of the muscle. Those days are gone. So I think Europe is going to be confronting the necessity of redefining what a European security mechanism should look like, independent of the United States. It's something that Emmanuel Macron spoke of prior to the current conflict in Ukraine. And I believe that once Russia wins decisively in Ukraine, Macron will understand that there is no option to build a NATO capable of standing up to Russia, that the best they can hope for is a diplomatic arrangement where Russia respects European security spheres of influence, Europe respects Russia's spheres of influence, and both sides seek to normalize the military balance of power. It's not in Russia's interest to have Europe militarize and build a whole new military, even though that might be the economic decline of Europe. Russia doesn't need the decline of Europe. Russia needs a stable Europe to be a stable trading partner and provide political stability on the Western flank. And so I think we're looking at a situation where NATO isn't going to survive more than another decade or so. And the inevitable collapse of NATO relieves a whole bunch of pressure from the Balkan states. One of the interesting questions is what happens when a reinvigorated Serbia decides to reassert its authority over Serbian territories, over territories they can consider Serbia, Kosovo, over the Srpska Republic in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and what Europe will be able to do in response, given that Russia will probably back the Serbians in this occasion. I think that's a future powder keg for Europe. Europe thought they got away with it, thought they avoided it, but it's there. It's not going away, and it's going to be a headache for Europe going forward.
Yeah, it certainly seems like a powder keg for the future, a few decades, which is bound to explode at some point, causing a bunch of blood and chaos. But we'll see the development of NATO, how NATO as an organization develops, what they'll be able to do with whether NATO will exist at all, whether the United States will be willing to engage in another expeditionary war, almost a colonial war against Serbia. But I guess that's a subject for another time. Thank you, Mr. Scott Ritter. Thank you for answering my questions. Thank you for being a guest at World Pravda. You've answered all my questions perfectly, and I hope to see you another time. I hope you come as a guest another time.
Well, it was a privilege, and I thank you very much for your questions, and I look forward to talking to you in the future. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. See you.
Okay.